Sarah Martinez adjusted her flight suit for the 100th time that morning, her fingers trembling slightly as she walked through the aircraft hangar. The massive military base stretched endlessly around her, filled with the thunderous roar of jet engines and the sharp commands of seasoned pilots. At 24, she was the youngest pilot ever accepted into the elite Eagle squadron, but that achievement felt hollow when she caught the whispered conversations that followed her. "Everywhere, there goes radio tag," she heard. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes muttered to his wingman as they passed by her locker. The nickname had stuck since her first week at the base, when she'd accidentally left her radio on during a training exercise and everyone heard her nervous breathing. What started as an innocent mistake had become a cruel reminder of how different she was from the others. The other pilots towered over her small frame, their voices booming with confidence as they discussed their latest missions. Sarah had grown up in a small farming town in Nebraska, where her father worked as a crop duster. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, she was learning about aircraft engines and weather patterns. Her father had taught her to fly in his old Cessna when she was just 14, recognizing a natural talent that even he couldn't fully explain. Despite graduating top of her class from the Air Force Academy and excelling in every simulation, Sarah found herself constantly proving her worth. During briefings, senior officers would ask her to repeat instructions twice as if they couldn't believe she understood complex flight maneuvers. In the mess hall, conversations would die when she approached, only to resume in hushed tones after she passed. The worst part wasn't the doubt in their eyes or the way they questioned her every decision. It was the radio tag itself, a small device clipped to her flight suit that had somehow become a symbol of her supposed inadequacy. The other pilots had expensive, high-tech communication equipment, while Sarah had been issued a standard-issue radio that occasionally crackled with static. During training exercises, she'd hear snickers over the comm when her radio would cut out for a split second. "Radio tag's having technical difficulties again," someone would joke, and the laughter would echo through her headset. She'd learned to double-check her equipment before every flight, but the nickname had already taken root. Sarah's commanding officer, General Morrison, was a stern man in his 50s who'd flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts. He watched her with the same skeptical expression that had become familiar to her. During their weekly evaluations, he'd review her perfect scores with a furrowed brow, as if searching for hidden flaws in her performance. "Martinez, your technical skills are impressive," he'd said during their last meeting, his voice carrying a note of reluctant admission. "But flying isn't just about following procedures. It's about instinct, about making split-second decisions when everything goes wrong. That's something you can't learn from a textbook." The words stung because Sarah knew there was some truth to them. She had studied every manual, memorized every protocol, and practiced every maneuver until it was perfect. But she also knew that deep down, she possessed something that couldn't be taught, an almost supernatural understanding of how aircraft moved through the sky. When she was flying, she could feel the wind patterns before the instruments detected them, sense mechanical problems before they showed up on diagnostics. Her fellow pilot, Captain Rodriguez, was one of the few who treated her with basic respect. During a particularly difficult formation flying exercise, he'd quietly helped her navigate the complex maneuvers without making her feel incompetent. "Don't let them get to you," he'd said afterward. "Half these guys couldn't fly a paper airplane in a thunderstorm, but they've got the right attitude for this place." The base gossip network was relentless. Sarah heard rumors about herself constantly, that she'd only been accepted because of diversity quotas, that her father had connections in Washington, that she was dating someone important. None of it was true, but the stories persisted, growing more elaborate with each retelling. She'd learned to keep her head down and focus on her work, but the isolation was wearing on her. In her small quarters at night, Sarah would stare at the ceiling and wonder if she'd made a mistake. The walls were covered with photos of famous pilots and technical diagrams of aircraft systems. Her desk was cluttered with flight manuals and maintenance guides that she'd read cover to cover multiple times. Everything in her room reflected her dedication to aviation, but lately, she questioned whether passion was enough. The radio tag sat on her nightstand, its metal surface scratched from months of use. Sometimes she'd pick it up and turn it over in her hands, thinking about all the times it had betrayed her during crucial moments. But she'd also remember her father's words from years ago. "The best pilots aren't the ones who never have problems, Sarah. They're the ones who solve problems so quickly that nobody else even notices there was a problem in the first place." Tomorrow would bring another day of proving herself, another opportunity to show that she belonged among the elite pilots of Eagle Squadron. Sarah had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that her much-mocked radio tag would soon become the most important piece of equipment on the entire base. For now, she simply closed her eyes and dreamed of flying, just as she had every night since childhood. The alarm pierced through the early morning silence like a knife, jerking Sarah awake from a restless sleep. Red emergency lights flooded her quarters as the base-wide announcement system crackled to life. All personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Sarah's training kicked in immediately, and she was dressed and running toward the command center within minutes. The hallways buzzed with controlled chaos as personnel rushed to their assigned positions. Through the windows, she could see maintenance crews scrambling around the aircraft, their movements urgent and precise. The Situation Room was packed with officers studying satellite images and radar displays. General Morrison stood at the center, his face grave as he received updates from various communication stations. Sarah found a spot near the back, trying to understand what was happening from the fragments of conversation she could overhear. Civilian aircraft down in the mountain region, she heard Captain Rodriguez tell another pilot. Search and rescue is scrambling, but the weather's turned nasty up there. Visibility near zero, and there's a storm system moving in fast. The details slowly became clear as General Morrison began the briefing. A commercial airliner carrying 127 passengers had lost contact during a routine flight over the Rocky Mountains. The last transmission had indicated severe turbulence and possible engine failure. Several rescue helicopters had already been dispatched, but the mountainous terrain and deteriorating weather conditions were making the search extremely difficult. We've got civilian rescue teams on the ground, but they're limited by the terrain, Morrison explained, pointing to the topographical map displayed on the main screen. The crash site is somewhere in this 50-square-mile area, most of it accessible only by air. We need every available aircraft and pilot ready for search operations. Sarah watched as the senior pilots received their assignments. The most experienced flyers would take the lead aircraft, equipped with advanced radar and communication systems. Others would fly in coordinated search patterns, maintaining radio contact with the ground teams and each other. As the assignments were handed out, Sarah noticed that her name wasn't called. Martinez, General Morrison finally said, almost as an afterthought. You'll remain on standby. Monitor communications from the radio room and coordinate with ground operations. The dismissal stung, but Sarah nodded professionally. As the other pilots filed out to prepare their aircraft, she made her way to the communications center, a cramped room filled with radio equipment and monitoring stations. The radio operator, Sergeant Collins, barely looked up as she entered. "You're back up today?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "Well, grab a headset and start monitoring Channel 7. That's where the search teams will be reporting in." For the next several hours, Sarah listened to the constant chatter between search aircraft and ground teams. The weather was worse than predicted, with heavy snow and winds gusting up to 60 miles per hour. One by one, the search planes reported the same thing: zero visibility and no sign of the missing aircraft. Eagle-3 to base, requesting permission to return. "Instruments are icing up and I can barely see my own wingtips," crackled through her headset. "Eagle-5 here. I've got whiteout conditions at 12,000 feet. There's no way to conduct an effective search in this weather." As the afternoon wore on, more aircraft were forced to return to base due to the severe conditions. Sarah could hear the frustration in the pilots' voices as they reported their lack of progress. Time was running out for the survivors, if there were any. In mountain crashes, the window for rescue was measured in hours, not days. The radio room gradually became the nerve center of the operation. Sarah found herself naturally coordinating between different search teams, relaying information about weather conditions and potential search areas. Her small size allowed her to move quickly between different radio stations, and her thorough knowledge of aircraft systems helped her interpret the technical reports coming in from the field. "There's got to be something we're missing," she muttered to Sergeant Collins during a brief lull in communications. "The plane didn't just disappear. Someone must have seen something or picked up a signal." Collins shrugged, his attention focused on adjusting the radio frequencies. "Sometimes planes just vanish in weather like this. Mountains do strange things to radar and radio signals. Could be weeks before anyone finds wreckage." Sarah studied the search grid on the wall, noting which areas had been covered and which remained unexplored. The crash site had to be somewhere in the blind spots, areas too dangerous for the larger aircraft to navigate in the current weather conditions. She picked up her own radio tag and checked its frequency settings, an idea beginning to form in her mind. During her years of flying with her father, they'd often used older radio equipment that operated on different frequencies than modern aircraft. Sometimes these older radios could pick up signals that newer equipment missed, especially in mountainous terrain where signals bounced unpredictably off rock faces and peaks. "Sergeant Collins," Sarah said, turning to face the communications operator, "what if we try scanning some of the older emergency frequencies? The aircraft might have switched to backup systems before going down." Collins looked skeptical, but began adjusting his equipment to scan the suggested frequencies. For several minutes, they heard nothing but static and occasional interference from distant commercial flights. Then faintly, almost hidden beneath the white noise, they heard something that made them both freeze. It was a voice, barely audible, repeating the same message over and over. "Mayday, Mayday. Flight 447 down. Survivors on board. Please respond." Sarah's hands shook as she fine-tuned her radio tag, trying to lock onto the signal. The voice was weak and intermittent, suggesting that the aircraft's radio was running on backup power or had been damaged in the crash. But it was definitely there, and it was definitely human. "We need to get this to General Morrison immediately," Collins said, reaching for his phone. "Wait," Sarah said, still working with her radio. "Let me see if I can get a better fix on their location first. If we can triangulate the signal, we can give the rescue teams a specific target instead of just another random transmission." She spent the next 20 minutes carefully adjusting frequencies and signal strength, using techniques her father had taught her for tracking aircraft in difficult conditions. Slowly, methodically, she began to narrow down the possible location of the signal source. The mountains were interfering with the transmission, but the consistent pattern of the distress call suggested that the aircraft was in a relatively stable position. When General Morrison finally arrived in the radio room, Sarah had prepared a detailed report with coordinates and signal strength measurements. For the first time since she'd arrived at the base, she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like respect. General Morrison studied the coordinates Sarah had provided, his weathered face creased with concentration. The location she'd pinpointed was in one of the most treacherous sections of the mountain range, a narrow canyon system known locally as Devil's Backbone. Even in perfect weather, it was challenging terrain for experienced pilots. "You're certain about this signal?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying both hope and skepticism. "We've had false alarms before, and I can't afford to send more aircraft into that canyon system unless we're absolutely sure." Sarah nodded confidently, pointing to the frequency analysis she'd compiled. "The signal pattern is consistent with a commercial aircraft's emergency beacon, sir. It's weak because they're probably running on backup power, but the transmission intervals match standard distress protocols. And based on the signal degradation, I estimate they're somewhere in this valley." She indicated a specific area on the topographical map. The weather reports continued to be grim. The storm system was intensifying, with snow falling so heavily that visibility was measured in feet rather than miles. Wind speeds were approaching dangerous levels, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding survivors alive. "The problem is getting to them," Captain Rodriguez interjected, having just returned from an unsuccessful search mission. "I tried to approach that area from the east, but the downdrafts are incredible. The canyon walls create wind patterns that could slam an aircraft into the rocks before you even know what's happening." General Morrison walked to the large window overlooking the flight line, where several aircraft sat grounded by the weather. The rescue helicopters were designed for precision work, but they were too vulnerable to the extreme wind conditions. The larger search planes had the power to handle the weather but lacked the maneuverability needed for the tight canyon navigation. "Sir," Sarah said quietly, "I might have a solution." Every head in the room turned toward her. She could feel the familiar weight of skeptical stares, but this time, the situation was too desperate for anyone to dismiss her outright. "The terrain where the signal is coming from requires a small, highly maneuverable aircraft," she continued. "Something that can handle extreme weather but also navigate tight spaces. Most of our standard aircraft are either too big or too delicate for those conditions." "What are you suggesting, Martinez?" Morrison asked. Sarah took a deep breath. "There's an older aircraft in Hangar 7, It's a modified reconnaissance plane that was used for mountain surveillance missions. It's small, extremely stable in rough weather, and has the range to reach the crash site and return. The only problem is that it requires a pilot with experience in precision flying and mountain navigation. The room fell silent as everyone processed her suggestion. The aircraft she was referring to was known among the pilots as the Mountain Goat, a small, unglamorous plane that had been designed specifically for flying in challenging terrain. It wasn't fast or particularly sophisticated, but it was reliable and could handle conditions that would ground other aircraft. That plane hasn't been flown in over a year, Captain Rodriguez pointed out, and even if it's airworthy, flying it in these conditions would be incredibly dangerous. The pilot would be navigating by instruments alone, in winds that could flip the aircraft without warning. General Morrison walked back to the radio equipment, listening once more to the faint distress signal that Sarah had isolated. The voice was getting weaker, suggesting that the survivor's situation was becoming increasingly desperate. He looked at the weather reports, the terrain maps, and finally at Sarah. "Martinez, you seem to know quite a bit about this particular aircraft," he said slowly. "Have you flown anything similar?" Sarah's heart raced as she realized what he was asking. "My father flew crop dusters in similar conditions, sir. I've logged hundreds of hours in small aircraft during severe weather, and I've studied the Mountain Goat specifications extensively." She paused, then added, "I believe I can get to them." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could practically hear the other officers' thoughts. The young pilot with the mocked radio tag, requesting permission to fly a dangerous rescue mission that had already defeated several more experienced aviators. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes was the first to speak. "With all due respect, sir, this is a critical rescue operation. We need our most experienced pilot on this mission, not someone who's never flown in combat conditions." "This isn't a combat mission," Sarah replied firmly. "It's a precision navigation and rescue operation. And with respect to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, none of our most experienced pilots have managed to locate the survivors yet." General Morrison studied her for a long moment, weighing the risks and options. The conventional approaches had failed and time was running out. The weather was only getting worse, and soon even the most experienced pilots wouldn't be able to attempt a rescue. "The Mountain Goat is equipped with older radio equipment," Morrison said thoughtfully. "Equipment that might be compatible with whatever system you use to locate the survivors." Sarah's radio tag seemed to grow heavier on her belt as she realized the irony of the situation. The same outdated equipment that had earned her ridicule might now be the key to saving lives. "Yes, sir. The frequency ranges are similar, and I should be able to maintain communication with the survivors throughout the approach." Sergeant Collins had been monitoring the distress signal continuously and looked up with alarming news. "The signal is getting weaker, sir. I estimate they have maybe 6 hours of backup power remaining, assuming their equipment doesn't fail completely." The pressure in the room was palpable. Every minute spent in discussion was a minute that the survivors didn't have. General Morrison looked at the satellite weather data one more time, noting that there was a brief window of slightly improved conditions predicted in the next few hours. "There's a narrow weather window opening up in about 2 hours, the meteorologist reported. "Visibility should improve to about a quarter mile, and wind speeds might drop to manageable levels. But it won't last long, maybe 90 minutes at most." General Morrison turned to Sarah, his expression serious but no longer skeptical. "Martinez, if you think you can reach them, I'm willing to authorize the mission. But understand that this is extremely dangerous. You'll be flying alone, in conditions that have already forced back several of our best pilots. If something goes wrong, we might not be able to reach you either." Sarah felt a mixture of terror and excitement coursing through her veins. This was the opportunity she'd been training for her entire life. But it was also potentially the most dangerous flight she'd ever attempted. She thought about the survivors somewhere in the mountains, counting on someone to find them before it was too late. "I understand the risks, sir," she said firmly, "and I'm ready to go." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of intense preparation. Sarah had never worked so hard to get an aircraft ready for flight. The Mountain Goat sat in the back corner of Hangar 7, covered in dust and looking decidedly unglamorous compared to the sleek fighter jets that dominated the flight line. But as she ran her hands over its sturdy frame and examined its systems, she began to appreciate the aircraft's practical design. Chief Mechanic Williams, a gruff veteran with 30 years of experience, helped her go through the pre-flight checklist. "This old bird might not be pretty," he said, checking the engine oil levels, "but she's tougher than a tank, built to handle mountain flying when other planes couldn't even get off the ground." The aircraft's radio system was indeed older than the standard equipment, but Sarah found it comfortingly familiar. It reminded her of the radios she'd used during her early training with her father. She carefully tuned it to the frequency where she'd detected the survivor's distress signal, pleased to find that the connection was stronger and clearer than with the base equipment. "Testing, testing. Flight 447, do you copy?" she transmitted. After a moment of static, a weak but distinct voice responded, "This is Flight 447, we copy." "Who is this?" Sarah's heart leaped. Direct communication with the survivors would make the rescue infinitely easier. "This is Eagle-7 from Mountain View Air Base. We have your location and are preparing a rescue mission." "What is your status?" "We have approximately 40 survivors," the voice replied, crackling with interference. "Several injuries, but most are stable. Aircraft is damaged but intact. We're in a narrow valley surrounded by high peaks. Weather conditions are severe." Sarah quickly relayed this information to General Morrison, who had joined her in the hangar along with several other officers. The news that there were 40 survivors added urgency to the mission, but also complexity. A single small aircraft couldn't evacuate that many people, which meant multiple trips or a larger rescue operation once the location was confirmed. The weather briefing was sobering. The meteorologist, Major Patterson, showed Sarah satellite images of the storm system. "You've got a narrow window starting in about 20 minutes, she explained. "Visibility should improve to about half a mile, and wind speeds should drop to 35 miles per hour. But this window is moving fast, and once it passes, conditions will be worse than before." Sarah studied the terrain maps one final time, memorizing the approach routes and emergency landing sites. The valley where the survivors were located was accessible from only one direction, through a narrow gap between two mountain peaks. The approach would require precise timing and navigation, with no room for error. "Remember," Captain Rodriguez said as he helped her adjust her flight suit, "mountain flying is all about reading the air currents. The rocks and valleys create invisible rivers of air that can lift you up or slam you down without warning. Trust your instruments, but also trust what you feel." As Sarah climbed into the cockpit, she noticed that many of the base personnel had gathered to watch her departure. Some faces showed concern, others curiosity, but there was no longer any mockery. The gravity of the situation had stripped away the petty prejudices and jokes. Lives depended on her success. The engine started with a reassuring rumble, and Sarah began her taxi toward the runway. The radio crackled with clearance from the control tower, but she could hear the tension in the controller's voice. Everyone understood that this was likely their only chance to reach the survivors before the weather made any rescue attempt impossible. "Eagle-7, you are cleared for takeoff," came the transmission. "Wind is currently gusting to 40 miles per hour from the northwest. Exercise extreme caution." Sarah pushed the throttle forward and felt the mountain goat respond eagerly. Despite its age and unglamorous appearance, the aircraft handled beautifully, rising smoothly into the turbulent sky. Within minutes, she was flying through the edge of the storm system, with snow and ice pelting the windscreen. The ride was rougher than anything she'd experienced in training. The aircraft was tossed around like a toy, rising and falling hundreds of feet in seconds as it encountered powerful air currents. But the mountain goat's design proved its worth, remaining stable and controllable even in the most violent turbulence. "Eagle-7 to base," Sarah transmitted, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm approaching the mountain range. Visibility is limited, but instruments are functioning normally. Copy, Eagle-7. Weather radar shows you're entering the worst part of the storm. Be advised that we're losing radio contact with some of the ground teams due to interference." As Sarah flew deeper into the mountains, the landscape below became increasingly hostile. Jagged peaks rose on all sides, their tops hidden in swirling clouds and snow. The valleys were filled with thick fog, making visual navigation nearly impossible. She relied heavily on her instruments and the GPS coordinates she'd calculated from the survivor's radio signal. "Flight 447, this is Eagle-7, she transmitted on the emergency frequency. "I'm approximately 15 minutes from your location. Can you give me any visual landmarks?" "Eagle-7, we're in a valley running north-south," came the reply. "There's a distinctive rock formation on the eastern wall that looks like a cathedral spire. The aircraft is in the southern end of the valley near a frozen lake. Sarah adjusted her course slightly, using the survivor's description to refine her approach. The radio signal was getting stronger, which confirmed that she was heading in the right direction. But the weather was also getting worse, with wind speeds that threatened to overwhelm even the mountain goat's capabilities. Suddenly, through a brief gap in the clouds, she caught sight of something that made her heart race. Far below, almost hidden in the swirling snow, she could see the distinctive shape of an aircraft's fuselage. The commercial airliner had come to rest in a narrow valley, just as the survivors had described. But reaching them would require flying through a gap between two mountain peaks that looked barely wider than her aircraft's wingspan. "Base, this is Eagle-7," Sarah transmitted, her voice tight with concentration. "I have visual contact with the crash site. Beginning approach now." The approach to the crash site was unlike anything Sarah had ever attempted. The gap between the mountain peaks was even narrower than it had appeared from a distance, and violent crosswinds threatened to slam her aircraft into the rocky walls on either side. She throttled back, reducing her speed to give herself more control. But this made the aircraft more vulnerable to the unpredictable air currents. "Eagle-7, we can hear your engine," came the transmission from the survivors. "You're very close, but be careful. The winds in this valley are extremely dangerous. We've watched debris being thrown around like paper." Sarah gritted her teeth and focused entirely on her flying. Every instinct her father had taught her about mountain aviation came into play. She could feel the air currents through the aircraft's controls, sensing invisible columns of rising and falling air that could either lift her to safety or dash her against the rocks. The mountain goat shuddered as it encountered a powerful downdraft, dropping nearly 100 feet in seconds. Sarah fought to maintain control, using every technique she'd learned to compensate for the violent air movements. Her radio tag bounced against her chest as the aircraft was buffeted by the winds, but she managed to keep the frequency locked onto the survivor's signal. "Almost there," she muttered to herself, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the freezing temperature outside. Through the snow and fog, she could make out more details of the crash site. The commercial airliner had apparently made a controlled emergency landing on the frozen lake, its fuselage intact but with obvious damage to both engines. "Flight 447, I can see you now," Sarah transmitted. "Your aircraft appears to be stable. Are you able to move survivors to an open area for evacuation?" "Affirmative, Eagle-7. We have several people who can't be moved due to injuries, but most of the survivors can walk." "Where do you need us?" Sarah circled the valley looking for a suitable landing site. The frozen lake where the airliner had come to rest was too rough and unpredictable for a safe landing. But she spotted a relatively flat area about half a mile from the crash site, partially protected from the worst winds by a ridge of rock. "I'm going to attempt a landing on the flat area northwest of your position," Sarah announced. "It's going to be rough, but I think I can get down safely." The landing was the most challenging part of the entire mission. The improvised runway was covered with snow and ice, making it impossible to judge the surface conditions. Sarah had to rely entirely on her experience and instincts, feeling for the ground through the aircraft's landing gear as she brought the mountain goat down in a controlled crash rather than a proper landing. The aircraft bounced twice before finally settling onto the uneven ground, sliding sideways before coming to a stop against a snowbank. For a moment, Sarah sat in the cockpit, hardly believing that she had successfully reached the crash site. Then she heard voices outside and realized that the survivors were already making their way toward her position. "Eagle-7 to base," she transmitted, her voice shaking with relief and exhaustion. "I have successfully landed at the crash site. Survivors are approaching my position, requesting immediate backup for evacuation operations." The response from base was filled with static, but she could make out General Morrison's voice. "Outstanding work. Eagle-7. Emergency medical teams are standing by. What is the condition of the survivors?" Sarah climbed out of the aircraft and was immediately surrounded by people in various states of injury and exhaustion. The flight crew of the commercial airliner approached first, their faces showing amazement at seeing a rescue aircraft in such impossible conditions. "I can't believe you made it through that storm," the pilot said, shaking Sarah's hand vigorously. "We've been listening to radio traffic all day, and it sounded like every rescue attempt had been called off." "Not every attempt," Sarah replied, opening the cargo compartment of her aircraft to retrieve emergency medical supplies and communication equipment. "But we need to work quickly. This weather window won't last much longer. The survivors were a mix of passengers and crew, ranging from children to elderly travelers. Several had obvious injuries from the crash landing, but most were suffering primarily from exposure to the cold and the psychological trauma of the experience. Sarah quickly established a communication link with the base medical team, providing detailed information about the injuries and the number of people requiring evacuation. "We've got 43 survivors total," she reported. 7 with serious injuries that require immediate medical attention, the rest with minor injuries or exposure symptoms. The good news is that most of them are ambulatory and can be evacuated in groups. The challenge now was getting everyone out safely. The mountain goat could carry 6 passengers at most, which meant multiple trips through the dangerous mountain passes. But Sarah realized that her successful navigation to the crash site had proven that the route was feasible, and other rescue aircraft could now follow the path she had established. "Base, I'm going to mark this landing site and begin evacuating the most seriously injured survivors," Sarah transmitted. "I recommend sending additional aircraft as soon as the weather permits. The approach is dangerous but doable if pilots follow my exact route." As she helped load the first group of survivors into her aircraft, Sarah noticed that her radio tag was getting much better reception than the base equipment had managed all day. The older frequency range was perfectly suited to the mountain environment, maintaining clear communication even when newer equipment failed. One of the survivors, an elderly woman with a broken arm, looked at Sarah with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "We thought nobody was coming." Sarah squeezed the woman's hand gently. "We never stopped looking for you," she replied. "That's what we do." The flight back to base with the first group of survivors was less challenging than the initial approach, partly because Sarah now knew the air patterns in the valley, and partly because the weather was beginning to clear slightly. As they emerged from the mountain passes, she could see other aircraft taking off from the base, following her route back to the crash site. "Eagle-7, this is Eagle-2, came a transmission from Captain Rodriguez. "I'm following your flight path with medical personnel on board. Your navigation markers are perfect. I can see exactly where to go." By the end of the day, all 43 survivors had been successfully evacuated from the crash site. Sarah had made 3 round trips herself, each time gaining confidence in the route and the aircraft's capabilities. The rescue operation that had seemed impossible 12 hours earlier had become a textbook example of successful mountain aviation and emergency response. As she climbed out of the mountain goat after her final flight, Sarah was exhausted but exhilarated. The aircraft that had carried her through the most dangerous flying of her career looked battered and weather-beaten, but it had performed flawlessly when it mattered most. The base was transformed when Sarah returned from her final rescue flight. What had been a scene of desperate urgency 12 hours earlier was now bustling with controlled activity as medical teams processed the rescued survivors and debriefing. Officers gathered information about the successful operation. Sarah found herself at the center of attention in a way that was completely different from the skeptical scrutiny she'd endured for months. Officers who had barely acknowledged her existence were now approaching her with questions about mountain flying techniques and emergency navigation procedures. The same pilots who had mocked her radio tag were now asking about the frequency modifications that had made communication with the survivors possible. General Morrison called her into his office for a private debriefing, but the atmosphere was completely different from their previous meetings. Instead of sitting behind his desk with a stern expression, he stood by the window, looking out at the aircraft that had made the rescue possible. "Martinez," he began, turning to face her, "what you accomplished today was extraordinary. In 30 years of military aviation, I've never seen flying skills like what you demonstrated in those mountains." Sarah felt a flush of pride, but she also knew that the success wasn't hers alone. "Sir, it was a team effort. The mechanics who prepared the aircraft, the communications specialists who helped track the signal, the medical teams who treated the survivors. Everyone contributed." Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of leadership thinking we need more of around here. But don't underestimate your own contribution. You found those survivors when our best equipment and most experienced pilots couldn't. You navigated terrain that should have been impossible in weather conditions that grounded every other aircraft on the base. The local news media had gotten word of the rescue operation, and Sarah found herself reluctantly agreeing to interviews about the mission. The story quickly spread beyond the immediate area, with aviation publications and rescue organizations asking for details about the techniques and equipment that had made the rescue possible. The key was understanding that sometimes older technology works better in certain conditions. Sarah explained to a reporter from Aviation Weekly. Everyone assumes that newer is always better, but radio frequencies that were designed decades ago can sometimes penetrate terrain and weather that defeats modern equipment. The same radio tag that had been a source of mockery was now being studied by communications specialists who wanted to understand why it had been so effective in the mountain environment. Sarah demonstrated the frequency adjustments and signal analysis techniques she'd learned from her father, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of civilian pilots. Captain Rodriguez approached her after one of the interviews, a broad smile on his face. "You know what this means, don't you?" he said. "You've just become the base expert on mountain rescue operations. Every pilot here is going to want to learn from you." The transformation in how her fellow pilots treated her was remarkable. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had been one of her harshest critics, approached her in the mess hall with what appeared to be genuine respect. "Martinez, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I made assumptions about your abilities based on things that had nothing to do with flying. What you did today proved that experience and knowledge matter more than anything else." Sarah appreciated the apology, but she also realized that the real lesson was bigger than just her individual achievement. "I think we all learned something about not judging capabilities by appearances," she replied. The aircraft that saved those people was sitting ignored in a dusty hangar because it wasn't flashy enough. Sometimes the most important tools are the ones that don't look impressive. General Morrison announced that Sarah would be leading a new mountain rescue training program, sharing her knowledge with other pilots and developing protocols for similar emergencies. The Mountain Goat would be restored and maintained as a specialized rescue aircraft, and several pilots would be trained in the unique flying techniques required for extreme terrain. Navigation, the most satisfying moment, came when she received a letter from the survivors of Flight 447. The elderly woman whose hand she had held during the first evacuation flight had written on behalf of all the passengers. "Dear Lieutenant Martinez, we wanted you to know that you didn't just save our lives that day. You restored our faith that people will never give up on each other. Your courage and skill gave us hope when we had none left. The sound of your aircraft engine will always be the most beautiful sound we've ever heard." Attached to the letter were photos from a reunion of the survivors, showing families that were together because of the rescue operation, children who might have grown up without parents, spouses who might have been widowed, grandparents who lived to see their grandchildren grow up, all because one young pilot with an old radio had refused to accept that the mission was impossible. Sarah kept the letter on her desk, next to the radio tag that had started as a symbol of mockery and become a symbol of determination. Pilots from other bases began visiting to learn about her rescue techniques, and she found herself teaching courses on mountain aviation and emergency communication protocols. The nickname radio tag gradually evolved into something different. New pilots arriving at the base would hear the story of Eagle-7's impossible rescue mission and the pilot who had used outdated equipment to achieve what modern technology couldn't. The name that had once been whispered in derision was now spoken with respect. 6 months after the rescue, Sarah was promoted to captain and given command of the newly formed Mountain Rescue Squadron. The ceremony was held in Hangar 7, with the restored Mountain Goat serving as the backdrop. As she received her new rank insignia, she looked out at the faces of her fellow pilots and realized that she had finally found her place. "Today we honor not just outstanding flying," General Morrison said during the ceremony, "but the kind of courage and determination that defines the best of military aviation." Captain Martinez didn't just save 43 lives that day. She reminded all of us why we serve. Sarah's father flew in from Nebraska for the ceremony, tears in his eyes as he watched his daughter receive recognition for skills he had helped her develop. "I always knew you had it in you," he whispered as he hugged her after the ceremony. "You just needed the right moment to show everyone else." As the sun set over the base that evening, Sarah stood next to the Mountain Goat, checking its systems one more time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, and new opportunities to prove that determination and skill mattered more than appearances or assumptions. The radio on her belt crackled with a routine communication from the control tower, and for a moment she smiled, remembering all the times that same crackling sound had been a source of embarrassment. Now it was simply the sound of people staying connected when it mattered most, which was exactly what rescue aviation was all about.